In the shadowed heart of 18th century Jamaica, where the sun bled gold over endless cane fields, a restless wind carried the scent of rebellion. The air was thick with the musk of earth and sweat, the rhythmic clatter of looms weaving secrets into cloth. Port Royal, 1720, a city of sin and splendor, clung to the edge of the sea like a lover afraid to let go. Its streets pulsed with the cries of merchants, the clink of coin, and the silent anguish of those bound in chains. Among them, in a crumbling weaver's hut, a woman named Keziah wove her days into patterns none could read. Her fingers, calloused and dark as the mahogany she touched, danced across threads with a grace that belied her station. Born a slave, her mother's blood tied to the Akan warriors of a distant shore, her eyes, deep as the night sky, held a spark that neither whip nor chain could dim. She was a weaver of dreams, her loom a quiet rebellion against the world that sought to break her. Each night, under the flicker of a single candle, she wove forbidden patterned symbols of freedom whispered from her mother's lips, tales of a land where no man knelt. But the overseer's shadow loomed large, his boots heavy on the earth, his voice a lash that cut deeper than leather. Keziah's world was one of silence, her spirit a caged bird beating against iron bars. Yet in the threads she wove, in the quiet hymns she hummed, there was a promise, a spark that waited for a single breath to ignite. The loom whispered to her, and she listened, knowing the world beyond the cane fields was stirring. Something was coming, something vast and unyielding, and Keziah, though she did not yet know it, would be its heart. The sun rose over Port Royal like a molten crown, its light glinting off the harbor where ships groaned under the weight of their rum and human souls bound for markets across the sea. The city was a paradox, its cobblestone streets lined with grand houses of coral stone, their balconies dripping with bougainvillea, while beyond in the shadow of the plantations, the air reeked of despair. Keziah's world was not the polished parlors of the gentry, but the suffocating heat of the weaveress quarter, where the clack of looms mingled with the cries of the chained. Her days began before dawn, her fingers threading stories into cloth while her heart stitched together fragments of hope. She was 23, her body lithe but scarred, each mark a testament to the overseer's cruelty. His name was Gideon Blackwood, a man whose pale eyes held no mercy, whose whip was as much a part of him as his shadow. To him Keziah was nothing a shadower, yet he watched her, his gaze lingering too long on the curve of her neck, the defiance in her stare. She felt it like a blade against her skin, a threat unspoken but ever present. The other slaves whispered of her beauty, a dangerous gift in a world where desire was a weapon wielded by the powerful. Keziah's mother, long dead, had taught her to hide her fire, to bow her head, to survive. But survival was a fragile thing, and Keziah's spirit chafed against it. Each night, as she wove, she traced the forbidden patterned spirals of resistance, stars of freedom knowing they could cost her life. The other weavers, older women with hands gnarled as roots, warned her to stop. The master sees everything, they hissed, their voices trembling with fear. But Keziah could not stop. The loom was her voice, her rebellion, her prayer. Beyond the hut, Port Royal buzzed with whispers of unrest. The Maroons, free men and women hidden in the Blue Mountains, were set to raid plantations, their blades flashing in the night. The governor's men patrolled the streets, their muskets gleaming, while the planters drank rum and boasted of their wealth, blind to the storm gathering at their gates. Keziah heard the rumors, felt the tension in the air like a taut thread ready to snap. She worked in silence, her fingers steady, her heart a drumbeat of defiance. But one evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a stranger appeared at the edge of the weaver's quarter. He was tall, his skin dark as ebony, his eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories. His clothes were tattered, his wrists marked by the ghost of manacles, yet he moved with the grace of a man who had once known freedom. He lingered by the fence, watching Keziah as she wove, his gaze not predatory but searching, as if he saw the spark she hid from the world. His name, she would later learn, was Amari, a man whose past was a tapestry of loss and secrets. That night, as Keziah lay on her pallet, the loom silent beside her, she felt a shift in her soul. The stranger's presence was a thread pulled loose, a pattern disrupted. She did not know who he was or why he had come, but she sensed he was the spark her heart had been waiting for. The world was turning, and Keziah, the weaver of dreams, stood at its edge, her hands trembling with the weight of what was to come. The loom whispered to her, still its voice clearer now, urging her to weave not just cloth but destiny. She closed her eyes. The stranger's face burned into her mind, and for the first time in years, she dared to dream of a world beyond the chains. But dreams were dangerous in Port Royal, and Keziah knew the cost of hope could be paid in blood. The night was heavy with promise and peril, and as the stars blinked above, she wondered if she was ready to face what lay ahead. The wind carried the scent of salt and rebellion, and Keziah's heart answered its call, a quiet vow to weave her own fate, no matter the cost. The dawn broke over Port Royal with a hush, as if the world held its breath, wary of the secrets stirring in its underbelly. The cane fields swayed under a restless sky, their green blades whispering of storms yet to come. Keziah rose from her pallet, her body aching from the weight of dreams that clung to her like damp cloth. The weaver's quarter was already alive with the clatter of looms, the air thick with the scent of lion sweat. She moved among the other women, her steps measured, her eyes lowered, but her heart burned with the memory of the stranger. Mario's gaze had pierced her like a needle through silk. Who was he? A runaway, perhaps, or a Maroon spy? His presence a dangerous thread in the fragile fabric of her world. Keziah was no stranger to danger. Born to a mother who sang of Aiken queens and a father she never knew, she had learned early that survival demanded silence. Her beauty, a curse cloaked in flattery, drew the overseer's eye, Gideon Blackwood, whose cruelty was as predictable as the tides. He ruled the plantation with a whip and a sneer, his voice a blade that cut through hope. To him, Keziah was a possession, her defiance a challenge he longed to break. That morning, as she worked her loom, weaving forbidden spirals into the cloth, Blackwood's shadow fell across her. His boots crunched on the dirt floor, his breath sour with rum. "You weave too slowly, girl," he growled, his pale eyes raking over her. "Or perhaps you think yourself above this work." Keziah's fingers stilled, her pulse a drumbeat in her throat. She knew better than to speak, but her silence was a rebellion in itself. The other weavers averted their eyes, their looms clattering louder to drown out the tension. Blackwood leaned closer, his hand brushing her shoulder, a touch that made her skin crawl. "Mind your place," he hissed, "or I'll teach you what happens to proud slaves." He lingered a moment longer, his threat a weight she carried long after he left. The day wore on, the sun a merciless eye overhead, but Keziah's thoughts were with Amari. She had seen him again, fleetingly, at the edge of the quarter, his silhouette blending with the dusk. He had not spoken, but his presence was a question she could not answer. Was he friend or foe, a savior or a harbinger of ruin? The other slaves whispered of him now, their voices low, their words laced with fear and hope. Some said he was a ghost, others a warrior, but all agreed he was trouble. That evening, as the moon rose silver over the cane fields, Keziah slipped from the hut, her bare feet silent on the earth. She moved toward the old tamarind tree at the plantation's edge, a place where the slaves gathered in secret to share stories and prayers. There, beneath its gnarled branches, she found it. Amari stood in the shadows, his eyes catching the moonlight like polished obsidian. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low, accented with the cadence of a land far from Jamaica. "Nor should you," Keziah replied, her defiance surprising even herself. He studied her, his gaze searching, as if peeling back the layers of her soul. "You weave more than cloth," he said at last. "I've seen your patterns. They speak of rebellion." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken of her secret, the symbols she wove in defiance of her chains. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fear and curiosity. Amari stepped closer, his presence both threat and promise. "I am a man who has lost everything," he said, and found it again in the fire of resistance. "I am here to break chains, Keziah, but I need those who dare to dream." His words were a spark, igniting something deep within her, a longing she had buried beneath years of pain. But trust was a luxury she could not afford. The plantation was a web of eyes and ears, and Blackwood's wrath was never far. Yet as she looked into Amari's eyes, she saw a reflection of her own fire, a mirror to her unspoken dreams. The night was alive with the hum of cicadas, the distant crash of waves, and the weight of a choice that could unravel her world. Keziah stood at the crossroads of fear and hope, her heart a loom, weaving threads of courage and doubt. To join Amari was to risk everything, her life, her secrets, her fragile dreams. But to turn away was to surrender to a life of chains. The tamarind tree loomed above them, its branches heavy with the ghosts of those who had dared before. Keziah's fingers twitched, as if longing for the loom, for the patterns that could shape her fate. Amari waited, his silence a challenge, his presence a thread she could not ignore. The world was shifting, and Keziah, the weaver of dreams, stood on the precipice of a rebellion that could burn Port Royal to ash. Her heart pounded, a rhythm of defiance, as she took a step toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me more." The tamarind tree stood sentinel in the Jamaican night, its gnarled limbs cradling shadows that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the island. Beneath its canopy, Keziah stood before Amari, her breath shallow, her heart a loom, weaving threads of fear and fire. The air was thick with the scent of earth and salt, the distant murmur of the sea a reminder of worlds beyond Port Royal's grasp. Amari's eyes, dark and unyielding, held hers with an intensity that felt like both salvation and doom. "You asked me to tell you more," he said, his voice a low rumble, like thunder rolling over the blue mountains. "But knowledge is a chain heavier than ire. Once you carry it, there is no turning back." Keziah's fingers curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms. She had spent her life weaving secrets into cloth, hiding her defiance in plain sight, But Amari's words were a needle piercing the veil of her caution. "I've carried chains all my life," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "What's one more if it leads to freedom?" Amari's lips curved. Not quite a smile, but a spark of approval flickered in his gaze. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them, and spoke in a whisper meant for her alone. "I am Amari, son of a king, stolen from Dahomey, and sold to this cursed shore. The Maroons call me brother, and I carry their fire. We plan to strike the heart of this plantation, to free those who dare to rise. But we need you. Your patterns are a map, a signal to those who dream of liberty." Her breath caught, the weight of his words settling like ash upon her shoulders. Her Padisso's forbidden spirals and stars were no mere art. They were a language, a call to arms, taught to her by her mother, who had died beneath Blackwood's whip. To know that Amari had seen them, understood them, was both a thrill and a terror. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've watched you," he admitted, his gaze unwavering, not with malice, but with hope. "The slaves speak of the weaver whose hands defy the master's will. Your courage is a flame, Keziah, and we need its light." The night seemed to tighten around them. The cicadas hum a chorus to their conspiracy. Keziah's mind raced, torn between the safety of silence and the perilous lure of rebellion. She thought of the weaver's quarter, of the women whose eyes were dulled by years of toil, of the children born into chains, their laughter stolen before it could bloom. She thought of Blackwood, his pale eyes and cruel hands, and the way he looked at her, as if she were a prize to be claimed. The memory of his touch burned, a violation that fueled her resolve. "What do you ask of me?" she said at last, her voice a thread pulled taut. Amari's expression softened, but his words were iron. "Weave your patterns, but bolder. Let them be seen by those who know their meaning. The Maroons will come when the time is right, but we must prepare the ground. You will be our voice, our signal, hidden in the cloth, the master's prize." The task was a blade, sharp and double. To weave openly was to court death, yet to refuse was to betray the spark her mother had kindled. Keziah's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the cane fields stretched like a sea of green chains. She saw her mother's face in her mind, fierce and unbowed, singing of a land where no one knelt. "I'll do it," she said, the words a vow, a rebellion, a prayer. Amari nodded, his hand brushing hers, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her, not of fear but of something deeper, unnamed. "Then we are bound," he said. "But beware, Keziah, Blackwood suspects more than he shows. His eyes are everywhere." As if summoned by his name, a rustle broke the night's stillness. Keziah froze, her heart lurching as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was not Blackwood, but Mersin, the older weaver whose loyalty to the master was as feared as his whip. Her eyes, sharp as flint, darted between Keziah and Amari. "What business have you here?" Mercy demanded, her voice a hiss. Keziah's pulse thundered, but Amari's calm was a rock against the tide. "Only words, mother," he said, his tone deferential yet firm. "A man may speak to a woman under the stars." Mercy's gaze lingered, suspicious, but she turned away, muttering of sin and punishment. Keziah exhaled, her body trembling with the nearness of betrayal. Amari's hand found hers again, a brief anchor in the storm. "Trust no one," he whispered. "Not yet." He melted into the shadows, leaving Keziah alone beneath the tamarind tree, her heart a battlefield of hope and dread. The next day she returned to her loom, her fingers trembling as she wove the boldest pattern yet, a spiral of stars, a map of rebellion. The other weavers noticed, their whispers a mix of awe and fear, but Keziah's resolve held firm. She was no longer just a weaver of cloth, but a weaver of fates, her hands threading the future of those who dared to dream. Yet Blackwood's shadow loomed larger, his gaze sharper, and Mercy's eyes followed her like a hawk. The plantation was a powder keg, and Keziah's patterns were the spark. Each thread she wove was a step toward freedom, but also toward peril. The air grew heavier, the whispers louder, and Keziah felt the weight of eyes upon her, some hopeful, some She worked through the day, her heart a drumbeat of defiance, her soul alight with the promise of Amari's words. But as night fell, a new fear gripped her. Mercy's silence was not surrender but a warning, and Blackwood's boots echoed closer, their rhythm a promise of retribution. Keziah's loom sang, but its song was a dirge as much as a hymn, and she knew the path she had chosen would demand a price she could not yet fathom. The stars above Port Royal blinked, indifferent to her fate, and Keziah wove on, her hands steady, her heart ablaze, knowing that each thread was a step toward a reckoning. The Jamaican sun hung low, a sullen orb casting long shadows across the cane fields, where the air shimmered with heat and unspoken rebellion. Port Royal buzzed with its usual chaos, merchants haggling, sailors cursing, and the ever-present clink of chains. But beneath the surface, a current of unrest pulsed, as if the island itself sensed the storm brewing in its heart. Keziah sat at her loom in the weaver's quarter, her fingers moving with a precision that belied the tempest within her. The spiral of stars she had woven the day before lay hidden beneath a pile of plain cloth, its bold lines a secret that could ignite a revolution or condemn her to the gallows. Amari's words echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain. "We need you, Keziah. Your patterns are a map." Each thread she wove now felt like a vow, a defiance against the chains that bound her body and the fear that sought to bind her soul. But the weight of Mercy's suspicious gaze lingered, a shadow as oppressive as Blackwood's whip. The older weaver had not spoken of what she saw beneath the tamarind tree, but her silence was a blade held to Keziah's throat, sharp and unpredictable. The other women in the quarter worked in hushed tension, their looms clattering like the bones of the dead, their eyes darting to Keziah with a mix of awe and dread. They knew her patterns were no mere decoration. They whispered of rebellion, of Maroons in the hills, of a world where the whip was silenced, yet fear kept their lips sealed, for Blackwood's cruelty was a specter that haunted every corner of the plantation. As the morning wore on, the air grew thick with the scent of molasses and dust, and Keziah's hands trembled as she began a new cloth. This one would be bolder still, a pattern of interlocking flames, a symbol her mother had called the fire of Asas, the Akanarth goddess who cradled the dreams of the oppressed. Each stitch was a prayer, each thread a cry for freedom, but the act was a tightrope walk over an abyss. If Blackwood or Mercy saw the truth in her work, the consequences would be swift and brutal. Her heart pounded, a rhythm that matched the distant drums she sometimes heard in the night, carried on the wind from the Blue Mountains. Those drums were the voice of the Maroons, Amari had told her, a call to those who dared to rise. Keziah wove faster, her fingers a blur, as if she could outrun the fear that clawed at her. She thought of Amari, his dark eyes burning with purpose, his hand brushing hers in the moonlight. He was a stranger, yet his presence had awakened something in her, a hunger for a life beyond the loom, beyond the chains. But trust was a fragile thread, and Keziah knew the plantation was a web of betrayal, where loyalty could shift like sand under the tide. Noon brought a stifling heat, and the weavers were allowed a brief respite, under the shade of a mango tree. Keziah sat apart, her back against the rough bark, her eyes scanning the horizon for a glimpse of Amari. He had vanished after their meeting, a ghost in the night, but his words had rooted themselves in her soul. She clutched a small scrap of cloth, a fragment of her mother's weaving, its faded spirals a reminder of the legacy she carried. The other women whispered among themselves, their voices low, but Keziah caught fragments of their fear. The Maroons are coming. Blackwood knows something. The weaver girl will bring ruin on us all. She wanted to shout, to tell them her patterns were for them, for their children, for a future where they could stand tall, but she held her tongue, knowing words alone could not pierce their fear. As she rose to return to her loom, a shadow fell across her path. Mercy stood there, her face a mask of scorn, her eyes glinting with something darker, envy, perhaps, or betrayal. "You think yourself clever, girl," she said, her voice a venomous hiss. "Weaving your secrets, meeting strangers in the dark. Blackwood will know. He always does." Keziah's stomach twisted, but she met Mercy's gaze, her own eyes blazing. "I weave what I must," she said, her voice low but firm, "as my mother did." Mercy's lips curled, but before she could speak, a shout rang out from the plantation house. Blackwood's voice, sharp as a blade, summoned the slaves to the yard. The weavers shuffled forward, their heads bowed, but Keziah's heart raced as she joined the throng. Blackwood stood on the veranda, his pale face flushed with rum and rage, a coiled whip in his hand. Beside him was a man Keziah had not seen before, a thin, wiry figure in a tattered red coat, his skin marked by the pockmarks of disease. He was a bounty hunter, the slaves whispered, a tracker of runaways who sniffed out rebellion like a hound. Blackwood's eyes swept the crowd, lingering on Keziah, and her blood ran cold. "There's talk of Maroons," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the humid air. "Talk of plots woven in the shadows. I'll have no rebellion here. The next soul who speaks of freedom will taste my whip." His gaze locked on Keziah, and for a moment she felt the world shrink to the space between them. His cruelty, her defiance, a thread stretched to breaking. The bounty hunter stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd like a vulture circling. "There's a man," he said, his voice nasal and sharp, "tall, dark, marked by chains, seen skulking near the weaver's quarter. Anyone who knows of him speaks now, or shares his fate." Keziah's heart lurched to Amari. They were hunting him. She felt Mercy's eyes on her, a silent accusation, but she kept her face blank, her hands steady. The yard was silent, the slaves fear a palpable weight, but no one spoke. Blackwood's whip cracked, a warning that drew a gasp from the crowd, and Keziah's resolve hardened. She would not betray Amari, not even if it cost her everything. As the slaves dispersed, Keziah returned to her loom, her mind a storm of fear and determination. She wove through the afternoon, her flames brighter, bolder, a beacon for those who dared to see. But the bounty hunter's presence was a noose tightening around the plantation, and Mercy's whispers grew louder, a poison seeping through the weaver's quarter. That night, As the moon hung low, Keziah slipped back to the tamarind tree, hoping to find Amari, to warn him. He was there, his silhouette a blade against the silver light, but his face was grim. "They know I'm here," he said, his voice taut. "But the plan moves forward. The Maroons are ready. Your patterns have reached them, Keziah. They know the time is near." Her heart swelled with pride, but fear clawed at her. "Mercy suspects," she whispered, "and Blackwood watches me." Amari's hand found hers, his touch a spark in the dark. "Then we must be swift," he said. "We've one last cloth, the signal for the strike. When the flames are seen, the Maroons will come." Keziah nodded, her throat tight with the weight of her task. But as Amari vanished into the night, a new figure emerged. Maggie, a young slave girl, no more than 12, her eyes wide with fear. "Keziah," she whispered, "Mercy's gone to Blackwood. She says you're plotting with the stranger." The words were a blow, and Keziah's betrayal was a whip sharper than any Blackwood wielded, and Mercy's treachery was a thread that could unravel everything. The night closed in, the drums in the distance, louder now, a call to war. Keziah stood alone, her heart a forge of fire and ash, knowing the next day would bring either freedom or ruin. She returned to her hut, her loom waiting like a silent ally, and began to weave, her hands trembling but unyielding, each thread a defiance of the chains that bound her. The flames took shape, a blazing map of rebellion, and Keziah poured her soul into them, knowing they might be her last. The night hung heavy over Port Royal, its darkness a shroud pierced only by the faint glow of fireflies and the distant pulse of maroon drums echoing from the Blue Mountains. Keziah sat at her loom, her fingers weaving flames into cloth, each thread a silent scream against the chains that bound her. The air in the weaver's hut was stifling, thick with the scent of lie and fear, but Keziah's hands moved with a feverish grace, as if the loom itself urged her on. Maggie's warning, "Mercy's gone to Blackwood," clawed at her mind, a venomous thread threatening to unravel the rebellion she had sworn to ignite. The flames she wove were no longer just symbols. They were a signal, a beacon for the Maroons, a map to the heart of the plantation where freedom would be won or lost. But with Mercy's betrayal, the delicate balance of secrecy had shattered, and Keziah felt the weight of eyes upon her. Blackwood's, Mercy's, and perhaps others she could not yet name. The plantation was a nest of serpents, and trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet the memory of Amari's touch, his voice like a river carving through stone, anchored her. "We've one last cloth," he had said, and Keziah poured her soul into the task, her heart a forge where hope and dread were hammered into defiance. Outside, the night was alive with whispers, the rustle of cane leaves, the creak of the overseer's boots, the soft sobs of a child in the slave quarters. Keziah's loom sang its quiet rebellion, but each clack of the shuttle felt like a heartbeat counting down to dawn. She wove through the hours, her fingers trembling with exhaustion, her eyes burning with unshed tears. The flames in her cloth grew bolder, their lines sharp and unyielding, a tapestry of fire that seemed to pulse with life. She thought of her mother, whose hands had woven the same patterns, whose voice had sung of a land where no one knelt. She thought of Amari, his eyes alight with a fire that mirrored her own, his words a promise of a world remade. But the specter of Mercy's betrayal loomed large, and Keziah knew the morning would bring a reckoning. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the hut, painting the dirt floor in shades of gold, a shadow fell across the threshold. It was not Blackwood, but Mercy herself, her face a mask of righteous fury, her eyes glinting with the zeal of one who believed betrayal was salvation. "You think you can outwit the master?" she hissed, her voice low to avoid waking the others. "Your patterns are in use, Keziah, and you'll hang us all with them." Keziah's hands stilled, her heart a drumbeat in her chest, but she met Mercy's gaze with a fire of her own. "I weave for freedom," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear that coiled within her. "You weave for chains, Mercy, whose soul is the heavier." Mercy's lips twisted, but before she could speak, the distant sound of boots silenced her. Blackwood was coming. The weavers' quarters stirred, the women rising from their pallets, their eyes darting between Keziah and Mercy. The air was thick with tension, a thread pulled taut, ready to snap. Blackwood entered like a storm, his pale eyes sweeping the room, his whip coiled at his side like a serpent ready to strike. Behind him stood the bounty hunter, his pockmarked face a grim promise of violence. "There's treason here," Blackwood growled, his voice cutting through the morning hush. "A weaver who dares to mock me with her cloth." His gaze locked on Keziah, and she felt the world narrow to the space between them. His cruelty, her defiance, a battle fought in silence. The bounty hunter stepped forward, holding a scrap of cloth, one of Keziah's earlier patterns, a spiral of stars she had thought hidden. "This was found in the market," he said, his voice nasal and sharp. "Sold to a merchant who speaks a Maroon." "Who wove it?" Keziah's heart lurched, but she kept her face blank, her hands folded in her lap. The other weavers were silent, their fear a palpable weight, but Mercy's eyes gleamed with triumph. "It was her," Mercy said, pointing at Keziah. "She weaves rebellion while we sleep." The accusation was a blade, and Keziah felt it sting, but she would not break. "I weave what I'm told," she said, her voice calm a lie woven with the skill of her craft. Blackwood's lips curled, and he stepped closer, his whip unfurling like a tongue tasting the air. "Liar!" He spat and raised the whip. The blow never fell. A cry rang out from the yard, a shout, then another, followed by the crack of muskets. The plantation was under attack. The Maroons had come, their blades flashing in the dawn, their drums a war cry that shook the earth. Chaos erupted as slaves scattered, some running toward the cane fields, others toward the promise of freedom. Blackwood roared, his whip forgotten as he drew his pistol, the bounty hunter at his side. Keziah seized the moment, grabbing the cloth of flames from her loom and slipping through the chaos, her heart pounding with a mix of terror and hope. She ran toward the tamarind tree, the meeting place Amari had named, her bare feet pounding the earth. The plantation was a maelstrom of smoke and screams, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. She found Amari there, his face streaked with sweat, a machete in his hand, his eyes alight with the fire of rebellion. "You did it," he said, his voice hoarse but fierce. "The flames were seen, the Maroons are here." Keziah clutched the cloth to her chest, its weight a testament to her courage, but the victory was fleeting. Blackwood's men were rallying, their muskets cutting through the dawn, and Keziah saw Maggie, the young slave girl, caught in the crossfire, her small body crumpling to the ground. A scream tore from Keziah's throat, a sound of rage and grief, and she ran to the girl, cradling her in her arms. Maggie's eyes fluttered, her breath shallow, but she whispered, "Keep weaving, Keziah." "For us." The words were a spark reigniting Keziah's resolve. She looked to Amari, who nodded, his face grim but determined. "We must move," he said. "The Maroons will hold them, but we need to reach the hills." Keziah rose, Maggie's blood staining her hands, her heart a furnace of pain and purpose. The cloth of flames was still in her grasp, a banner of defiance, and she followed Amari into the chaos, her soul alight with the promise of freedom, even as the cost of it burned through her. The plantation was a battlefield, and Keziah, the weaver of dreams, was now a warrior, her hands stained with blood and hope, her heart a loom weaving a future from the ashes of the past. The dawn over Port Royal was a wound torn open, its sky streaked with smoke and the crimson glow of flames licking at the edges of the cane fields. The plantation was a crucible, its air thick with the acrid bite of gunpowder, the screams of the fallen, and the defiant roar of the Maroons as they carved their rebellion through the heart of oppression. Keziah ran through the chaos, her bare feet pounding the earth, the cloth of flames clutched to her chest like a sacred relic. Maggie's blood stained her hands, a scarlet vow that fueled her steps, each one a defiance of the chains that had bound her life. Amari led the way, his machete a silver arc in the half-light, his eyes fierce with a purpose that mirrored her own. The tamarind tree was behind him now, its gnarled branches a fading sentinel as they plunged toward the promise of the Blue Mountains, where freedom waited like a distant star. But the path was a gauntlet of peril, the plantation's edges patrolled by Blackwood's men, their muskets flashing in the dawn, their shouts a cacophony of rage and fear. Keziah's heart thundered, a drumbeat that drowned out the cries around her. But Maggie's whispered words keep weaving. "For us were a thread that held her together, a lifeline in the storm." The cane fields loomed like a green labyrinth, their stalks sharp and unyielding, slicing at Keziah's arms as she followed Amari through their tangled embrace. The air was heavy with the sweet rot of molasses and the bitter temps of blood, the ground slick with dew and the fallen. Behind them, the plantation house burned, its coral stone walls blackened by the Maroons' torches, a beacon of ruin that sent a shiver of hope and dread through Keziah's soul. Amari moved like a shadow, his steps silent despite the chaos, his presence a steady flame in the darkness of her fear. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice taut but calm, "a anchor in the mill." Keziah nodded, her breath ragged, her eyes scanning the shadows for Blackwood or the bounty hunter, whose pockmarked face haunted her like a specter. Mercy's betrayal had set this fire, and Keziah knew the older weaver's words had reached Blackwood's ears, turning the plantation into a trap. Yet the Maroons' attack had shifted the balance, their blades and drums a symphony of rebellion that gave Keziah a fleeting hope. She clutched the cloth tighter, its flames a map not just for the Maroons but for her own heart, guiding her toward a future she could scarcely imagine. They reached the edge of the cane fields, where the land sloped upward toward the foothills, the Blue Mountains rising like sentinels of salvation. But the path was blocked a line of Blackwood's men, their muskets raised, their faces grim with the knowledge that their world was crumbling. Amari pulled Keziah behind a cluster of palms, his hand firm on her wrist, his eyes scanning the enemy. "We wait," he murmured. "The Maroons will draw them away." Keziah's chest heaved, her lungs burning, but she nodded, her trust in Amari a fragile thread stretched across the abyss of her fear. The cloth of flames was heavy in her hands, its weight a reminder of the lives it represented, her mother's, the countless souls who had dreamed of freedom beneath a whip. She thought of the weaver's quarter, of the women who had watched her with fear and awe, their silence a shield and a cage. Had any of them joined the Maroons, or had they stayed, too broken to rise? The question gnawed at her, but there was no time for answers. A shout broke the stillness, and the line of muskets wavered as a group of Maroons burst from the cane, their machetes flashing, their cries a challenge to the heavens. The soldiers turned, their shots wild, and Amari seized the moment. Now, he hissed, pulling Keziah forward. They ran, their feet sinking into the soft earth, the mountains looming closer with each step. But the world was not done with its cruelties. A figure emerged from the shadows, a lone soldier, his musket raised, his eyes locking on Keziah. Time slowed, the air thick with the weight of fate. She saw the spark of the flint, heard the crack of the shot, and felt Amari's body slam into hers, pushing her to the ground. The bullet grazed his shoulder, a red line blooming across his skin. But he was up in an instant, his machete a blur as he struck the soldier down. Keziah scrambled to her feet, her hand shaking as she touched Amari's wound, the blood hot against her fingers. "You're hurt," she gasped, but he shook his head, his face grim. "No time," he said, pulling her onward. The mountains were close now, their slopes a promise of refuge, but the cost of each step was written in blood. Keziah's heart ached for Maggie, for Amari's pain, for the lives left behind in the burning plantation. Yet the cloth in her hands was a fire that would not die, its flames a testament to her refusal to break. They reached a narrow gorge, its walls steep and shadowed, a hidden path the Maroons used to slip through the hills. Amari paused, his breath heavy, his eyes searching hers. "You're more than a weaver now," he said, his voice low but fierce. "You're a spark, Keziah. The Maroons fight because of you." His words were a blade, cutting through her doubt, but they also brought a new weight. She was no longer just a woman weaving dreams. She was a symbol, a beacon, and the responsibility was a chain of its own. Keziah's legs burned, her lungs screamed, but she ran, the cloth of flames her only anchor, and the cries of men locked in a dance of life and death. His pock-marked face emerged from the smoke, his eyes locking on Keziah with the hunger of a predator. They were the keepers of the rebellion's heart, guarding supplies, weapons, and the dreams of those who fought. To stay was to risk capture. To run was to abandon those who fought for her. Keziah's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of fear and resolve. She thought of her mother, unbowed even as the whip took her life. She thought of Maggie, her small body crumpled in the dirt, her final words a plea to keep weaving. And she thought of Amari, his strength and scars, his belief in a world remade. "I won't run," Keziah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "The cloth must live, but so must the fight." Nia's lips curved, a rare smile that spoke of respect. "Then we make a stand," she said, signaling to the others. The Maroons moved swiftly, setting traps along the path, sharpened stakes, hidden pits, ropes strung to trip the unwary. Keziah helped where she could, her hands clumsy but determined, the cloth tucked safely in a hollow tree. As they worked, she felt a shift within her, a hardening of her spirit. She was no longer just a weaver, no longer just a slave. She was a warrior, her courage woven from the threads of those who had come before her, those who fought beside her, those who would carry her dream forward. Nia handed Keziah a waterskin, her gaze softening for a moment. "Rest here," she said. "The cloth must be safe." Keziah nodded, sinking to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. She pulled the cloth from beneath her dress, its flames glowing in the dim light, and felt a surge of pride and terror. This was her mother's legacy, Maggie's sacrifice. Amari's Hapa map, a rebellion that could light the way to freedom or burn them all to ash. As she traced the woven flames, her mind drifted to the battle still raging in the clearing. Was Amari alive? Had the Maroons held the line? The questions were a needle in her heart, each one drawing blood. But there was no time for doubt. A rustle in the underbrush snapped her back to the present, and Nia's spear was up in an instant, her body tense. It was not a soldier, but a young Maroon boy, his eyes wide with urgency. "They're coming," he gasped. Blackwoodsmen broke through. Amari is holding them, but they're hunting the weaver. Keziah's heart lurched, her hands tightening around the cloth. The rebellion was teetering, and she was its heart, its target, its hope. He was flanked by two soldiers, their bayonets gleaming, their faces twisted with the thrill of the hunt. Keziah's instincts screamed to run, but her feet were rooted, her heart bound to the Maroons, to Amari, to the cloth that carried her mother's dreams. A Maroon woman, the one with scars like rivers, grabbed Keziah's arm, her grip iron. "Weaver," she hissed, pulling her toward a narrow path that snaked deeper into the mountains. The cloth must not fall. Keziah stumbled after her, the sounds of battle fading but never vanishing, a haunting echo that followed them into the shadows. The path was steep, the rocks slick with moss, the air damp with the breath of the earth. Keziah's legs burned, her lungs ached, but she clung to the cloth, its flames of fire in her soul. The Maroon woman, whose name she learned was Nia, moved with the grace of a panther, her spear a silent promise of protection. "You're the spark," Nia said, her voice slow but fierce. "Your patterns woke us. We fight because of you." Keziah's throat tightened, the weight of her role, a chain she both cherished and feared. She was no warrior, no queen, only a weaver whose hands had dared to dream. Yet here, in the heart of the mountains, she was something Mara's symbol, a hope, a thread in a tapestry larger than herself. Dawn's light bled through the canopy, casting jagged shadows over the Maroons, their faces fierce with defiance, their blades flashing like shards of the sun. Keziah stood at the edge of the fray, her heart a thunderous drum, the cloth of flames pressed against her chest beneath her tattered dress. Its weight was both burden and beacon, a silent vow that tethered her to the rebellion she had helped ignite. Amari fought at the center of the clearing, his machete a blur, his wounded shoulder slowing him but not breaking him. His eyes, dark and unyielding, met hers for a fleeting moment, a spark of trust that burned through the haze of battle. The Maroons were outnumbered, Blackwood's men relentless, their muskets spitting fire and lead, but the rebels fought with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. Keziah's breath came in sharp gasps, her hands trembling as she scanned the chaos, searching for a way to protect the cloth, to honor Maggie's sacrifice, to keep the fire of rebellion alive. Behind them, the hounds grew louder, their howls a promise of death. Amari's wounds slowed him, his steps faltering, but he pressed on, his will a fire that refused to die. Keziah's mind raced, her thoughts a tangle of fear and hope. She saw her mother's face, heard her songs of Aiken queens, felt the weight of her legacy. She saw Maggie's crumpled form, her whispered plea, and she saw Amari, his strength and his scars, a man who had lost everything yet fought for a dream. The gorge opened into a clearing, where a small band of Maroons waited, their faces painted with ash, their eyes alight with defiance. They welcomed Amari with nods, their hands gripping spears and machetes, but their gazes lingered on Keziah, on the cloth she carried. The weaver one whispered, a woman with scars like rivers across her face. "Her flames called us." Keziah's heart swelled, but there was no time for pride. The hounds were close, Blackwood's men closer still. The Maroons formed a line, their weapons ready, and Amari turned to Keziah, his eyes fierce. "Hide the cloth," he said. "If we fall, it must live." Keziah nodded, tucking the cloth beneath her tattered dress, its warmth a promise against her skin. The clearing was a crucible, the mountains a witness, and Keziah stood at the heart of it, her soul a loom weaving courage from fear, hope from despair. The hounds broke through, their teeth gleaming, and the battle began, a clash of steel and will that would decide the fate of the weaver's rebellion. She looked at the cloth in her hands, its flames glowing in the dim light of the gorge, and felt a surge of resolve. "For Maggie," she said, her voice steady. "For my mother. For all of us." Amari nodded, his hand brushing hers, a fleeting touch that spoke of trust and something deeper, unspoken. But the moment was shattered by a new sound, a baying of hounds, the shouts of Blackwood's men, closing in. The bounty hunter was among them, his voice a nasal snarl that carried through the gorge. The weaver girl and the runaway. "Find them." Keziah's heart lurched, but Amari's grip tightened. "We move," he said, leading her into the gorge, its walls closing around them like the jaws of a beast. The path was treacherous, the rocks sharp underfoot, the air damp and cold. The clearing in the Blue Mountains was a cauldron of chaos, the air rent with a clash of steel, the snarls of hounds. The bounty hunter's voice cut through the din, a nasal snarl that chilled her blood. "The weaver girl, she's here." The path opened into a hidden grove, where a small group of Maroons waited, their faces painted with ash, their eyes alight with purpose. Nia's eyes met Keziah's, a silent question passing between them. The first soldiers appeared at the grove's edge, their muskets raised, the bounty hunter at their lead. His eyes found Keziah, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. Her eyes met Keziah's, a fierce nod passing between them, a silent vow to protect the weaver and her cloth. The Maroon camp was close now, hidden in a valley where the trees grew thick, and the streams sang of freedom. The Maroons in the grove were buying them time, but time was a thread unraveling fast. "The weaver," he called, his voice carrying over the wind. "She's here." The camp stirred, figures emerging from the shadows, their weapons ready, their faces alight with the fire of rebellion. Keziah's heart swelled, but there was no time for relief. Blackwood's men burst onto the ridge, their bayonets gleaming, and Amari turned to face them, his machete raised despite his wounds. He shouted, his voice a command and a plea. Keziah hesitated, her heart tearing at the thought of leaving him. But Nia appeared, her spear bloodied, her eyes fierce. "The cloth," she barked, pulling Keziah toward the camp. Keziah ran, tears blurring her vision, the cloth a burning weight in her hands. She reached the camp's edge, where a Maroon elder, his hair white as ash, took the cloth with reverent hands. "The flames," he murmured, his eyes tracing the woven fire. "You've brought us hope, weaver." Keziah's chest heaved, her body trembling with exhaustion and grief. But she turned back to the ridge, where Amari fought alone, his machete a fading light against the tide of soldiers. A scream tore from her throat as she saw him falter, a bayonet catching his side, his body crumpling to the ground. The world seemed to still, the mountains holding their breath, and Keziah ran toward him, heedless of the danger, her heart ablaze that refused to die. She reached him as the soldiers closed in, her hands cradling his face, his blood warm against her skin. "Amari," she whispered, her voice breaking. His eyes found hers, weak but fierce, and he smiled, a fleeting curve of his lips. "Keep weaving." She looked at Amari, his face pale with pain, his eyes still fierce, and felt a surge of something deeper than trust, a bond forged in blood and fire, a love unspoken but undeniable. "If we die here," she whispered, her voice trembling, "the cloth must live." Amari's gaze softened, his hand brushing her cheek, a fleeting touch that spoke of all they could not say. "It will multiply the impact with a single word lit." He rose, pulling her with him, and they ran, the ridge narrowing to a perilous ledge where one misstep meant death. The hounds were closer now, their snarls a chorus of doom, and Keziah's heart raced as she clutched the cloth, its weight a reminder of every soul who had dared to dream. The Maroon camp was in sight, a cluster of huts hidden in the valley's embrace, but Blackwood's men were gaining, their muskets a deadly promise. Keziah's mind flashed to her mother, to Maggie, to the weavers who had watched her with fear and hope. She was their spark, their flame, and she would not let it die. But the ridge was exposed, a blade's edge between salvation and ruin. Keziah's heart pounded as she glanced back, seeing the glint of muskets in the distance, the dark shapes of Blackwood's men moving like wolves through the underbrush. Amari's face was grim, his shoulder a map of blood, but he pressed on, his strength a beacon that kept Keziah moving. "You're the fire now," he said, his voice strained but fierce. "They can't break it if you don't break." His words were a needle, stitching her courage back together, and she nodded, her eyes blazing with a defiance that matched the flames in her hands. But the moment was shattered by a crack of gunfire, a bullet whistling past her ear, splintering the bark of a nearby tree. Blackwood's voice roared from below, a venomous bellow that carried the weight of his rage. "The weaver, bring me the weaver." Keziah's blood ran cold, but Amari pulled her down behind a boulder, his body shielding hers as another shot rang out. "Go," Naya shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The path to the camp is clear, but not for long." Keziah hesitated, her heart torn between the urge to fight and the need to carry the cloth to safety. Amari's hand found hers, his grip steady despite his wounds, and the touch was a spark that steadied her. "Together," he said, his voice a low rumble, a promise that tethered them through the storm. They ran, weaving through the grove's shadows, the Maroons covering their retreat with a ferocity that shook the earth. The path climbed steeply, the rocks jagged underfoot, the air damp with the breath of the mountains. Keziah's lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she clung to the cloth, its flames of fire that refused to die. Behind them the battle's din faded, but the hounds were relentless, their howls a promise of pursuit. Blackwood himself was out there, Keziah knew, his pale eyes hungry for her blood, his whip a specter that haunted her every step. "There's the weaver," he sneered, raising his pistol. But the Maroons were ready. Near spear flew, striking a soldier in the chest, and the grove erupted in chaos. Keziah dove behind a rock, her heart pounding, her hands empty but her spirit alight. The Maroons fought with a ferocity that shook the earth, their blades and traps cutting through Blackwood's men like a scythe through cane. Keziah's eyes searched for the cloth, her heart racing as she saw a soldier stumble near the hollow tree. She crawled forward, her body low, her breath shallow, determined to protect the flames that had sparked this rebellion. A musket shot grazed her arm, a sharp burn that drew a gasp, but she pressed on, her fingers closing around the cloth just as the bounty hunter's shadow fell over her. "You'll hang for this," he growled, his pistol aimed at her heart. But before he could fire, a figure lunged from the shadows. Amari, his machete flashing, his face a mask of fury. The bounty hunter fell, his blood soaking the earth, and Amari pulled Keziah to her feet, his wounded shoulder bleeding anew. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For you," he said, his eyes fierce with a fire that matched her own. The battle raged around them, but in that moment, they were a single thread, woven together by sacrifice and hope. The cloth of flames was in her hands, its weight a promise, and Keziah knew she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just a spark, she was a blaze, and the rebellion would burn with her. The grove in the Blue Mountains was a crucible of blood and fire, its air thick with the acrid temps of gunpowder and the raw, coppery scent of sacrifice. The Maroons fought with the ferocity of a storm, their blades and spears weaving a deadly dance against Blackwood's men, whose muskets spat death into the dawn. Keziah stood with Amari, the cloth of flames clutched to her chest, its woven embers a pulse against her heart. Her arm throbbed where the musket shot had grazed her, a sharp reminder of the cost of rebellion. But the pain was a distant echo compared to the fire in her soul, Amari's shoulder bled freely now. His machete slicked with the blood of the bounty hunter who lay dead at their feet, yet his eyes burned with an unyielding resolve. "We can't stay here," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the battle's toll. "The cloth must reach the Maroon camp. It's the signal to rally the others." Keziah nodded, her throat tight with fear and determination. The cloth was more than a symbol now, it was the heart of the rebellion, a beacon that had drawn the Maroons from their hidden strongholds, a map of hope woven from her mother's dreams and Maggie's sacrifice. But the grove was a battlefield, and Blackwood's men were closing in, their shouts and baying hounds a relentless tide. Nia, the scarred Maroon woman, fought nearby, her spear a whirlwind as she cut through a soldier who strayed too close. The path opened into a narrow ridge, the blue mountains stretching before them like a tapestry of green and shadow, their peaks kissed by the rising sun. The ridge was a trap, and Keziah knew it. A sudden shout from above broke her thoughts. A Maroon scout, perched on a cliff, waving a torch. He whispered, echoing Maggie's words, and then his eyes closed, his body still. Keziah's scream was a raw, primal thing, a sound that shook the heavens. His eyes, deep with the wisdom of years, met Keziah, and he spoke with a voice that carried the weight of ancestors. "This is more than cloth," he said, tracing the woven flames. But the Maroons were ready, their camp a stronghold of defiance. Keziah stayed among them, her hands no longer bound to a loom but to the work of freedom, teaching others to weave the patterns, to spread the fire, to dream of a Jamaica where no one knelt. Years later, the cloth of flames would be spoken of in whispers, a relic of the rebellion that had shaken Port Royal's foundations. Some said it was hidden in the mountains, others that it had been carried across the sea, a symbol of hope for those still in chains. Keziah's name became a story, a song sung by those who dared to rise, a flame that burned through the ages. She never forgot Amari's touch, Maggie's sacrifice, or the weight of her mother's legacy. Her life was a tapestry of pain and hope, woven with the courage of those who had fought beside her. The blue mountains stood watch over her, their peaks a testament to the fire that could not be quenched, and Keziah the Flameborn carried their dream forward, her heart a loom that wove a future from the ashes of the past. The rebellion was not the end, but a beginning, a spark that would light the way for generations, a crown of ashes that burned with the promise of freedom. It is a story, a promise of fire that will burn through the chains of this island. "You have given us that, Keziah, daughter, vacant blood." He placed the cloth in her hands, its warmth a spark against her grief, and Keziah felt the weight of her mother's songs, Maggie's sacrifice, Amari's courage. She rose, her legs unsteady, her arm throbbing where the musket had grazed her, but her spirit was a loom weaving resolve from ruin. The camp was alive with purpose, the Maroons planning their next move, their drums a quiet pulse that spoke of battles yet to come. Blackwood was not defeated, Keziah knew. His rage would burn hotter now, his whip sharper, his men relentless. Port Royal would not fall easily, its coral stone walls a fortress of cruelty. But the rebellion was a fire that could not be doused. Keziah looked at the cloth, its flames a mirror to her soul, and knew she could not stop. Not for Amari, not for Maggie, not for herself. The rebellion was her thread, her pattern, her legacy, and the Maroons rallied around her, their blades driving back the soldiers, their cries a chorus of defiance, her voice steady as she spoke of the weaver's quarter, of the women who might yet rise, of the patterns that could spread the fire of rebellion. The Maroons listened, their eyes alight with respect, their hands ready to fight. Nia stood beside her, her spear a silent vow, and Quaim nodded, his white hair a halo in the morning light. "You are no longer just a weaver," he said. "You are a warrior, a storyteller, a flame." Keziah's heart swelled, but it was a bittersweet tide, carrying the weight of those she had lost. She thought of Amari's smile, fleeting and fierce, of Maggie's whispered plea, of her mother's songs that had woven defiance into her bones. The cloth was their legacy, but so was she, a woman born in chains, now a spark in the darkness, a weaver of dreams that could remake the world. The Maroons gave her a new name that day, the Flameborn, and Keziah embraced it. Her grief a forge where courage was shaped. She wove again that night, not with a loom, but with words telling the Maroons of her mothers, Achaean queens of the stars and spirals that had sparked their fight, of the hope that burned brighter than any whip could break. The cloth was safe, the rebellion alive, but Keziah's heart was a ruin, her hands stained with the blood of those she loved, her soul a loom weaving grief into courage. The blue mountains stood sentinel over the valley, their peaks cloaked in mist, their silence a requiem for the blood spilled in their shadow. The Maroon camp was a heartbeat of defiance, its huts nestled among the trees, their roofs woven with the resilience of those who refused to kneel. Keziah knelt beside Amari's still form, her hands trembling as they traced his face, his blood a warm stain on her skin. His final words keep weaving a thread that bound her shattered heart. The cloth of flames, now safe in the hands of the Maroon elder, glowed in the dim light of the camp, its woven fire a testament to the rebellion that had cost so much yet promised more. The battle on the ridge had ended, Blackwood's men driven back by the Maroons' ferocity, their muskets no match for the fire of those who fought for freedom. But the victories was a hollow thing, its price etched in the bodies left behind. Maggie, and countless others whose names Keziah would never know. Her tears fell like rain, each one a prayer for the souls lost, each one a vow to carry their dream forward. The Maroons moved around her, their voices low, their hands gentle as they tended the wounded and prepared for the next fight. Nia, her scarred face softened by grief, knelt beside Keziah, her spear resting across her lap. "He was our brother," she said, her voice steady but heavy, "and you are our sister now. The weaver who brought us fire." Keziah's throat tightened, the weight of her role a crown of ashes she was not sure she could bear. Yet the cloths, its flames, a map of hope, was a legacy she could not abandon. The elder, whose name was Kwame, approached, the cloth held reverently in his gnarled hands. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold, Keziah joined the Maroons in their council. The rebellion did not end that day. Blackwood's men would return, their muskets and hounds a relentless shadow.